say about Brother Hakeem. I think you all can see that you are here, I'm here because of our deep love for the precious young people. And I'm very much here because of my dear Brother Hakeem and Sister Cara came to my office at Princeton University just a few months ago. Almost, what, about 9 months, 10 months, 12 months or so? Ooh, you all, is it 2 years now? It was right around Prince's musicology album, I think. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Whoa!
Oh, there it is. But yeah, we go all the way back. But no, in all seriousness, though, that it has everything to do with love, let me see. The sense of our young people not receiving enough love and care and concern, and targeting them in such a way that their potential, their possibility can expand and their lives can flower and flourish. And when I hear my dear brother Hakeem speak, I do go back to that freshman year, and I walked into that introductory class, Introduction to Afro-American Studies at Harvard at the time, and I was in the midst of some controversy. And we must have had about 900 people in that class, and yet each one was so precious. When my dear brother walked in with his poetry, when he first told me, of course, he was from Uniondale, he had to break that down for me. I know the Bronx and Brooklyn and Harlem. Oh, yes, but he mentioned Uniondale. I said, well, I lived in Springfield Garden. You might remember, I said, I lived in Springfield Garden for a summer and took the E train from Merritt Boulevard, but was Uniondale a little further out than that? Oh, that's right. But then when I think of giants like Eddie Murphy, Chuck D, so many other towering figures that come out of this particular region of the country, it's clear, of course, that Uniondale has been on the map for a long time. Relatively ignorant brothers from California like myself have much to learn. But I do want to salute Brother Hakeem and Sister Cara as well, and the hard-working young people. I mean, you all know from the older generation, those like myself from the Motown, Philly Sound, Stax, Curtis Mayfield generation, that when you see young people come together to be a force for good, so that as they leave the community, they move into the higher echelons, they are empowered, they are ennobled, they are enabled, but then they come back to the community to empower and enable and ennoble. That is a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. We want to salute that. We want to salute that tonight. I want to especially highlight Sister Brianna Adams. Already got 2 years of employment. Yes, in 5th grade. Woo! And she was so eloquent. These days, especially in mass media, you have to distinguish between being eloquent and articulate. Articulate is just fancy deployment of wordsmithery. The great Cicero and Quintilian, towering Roman figures who usually don't expect too much profundity from the Romans. They define wisdom as define eloquence as wisdom speaking from the soul. You see, when that sister was standing there reading, it wasn't just the words. You could feel that her experience in that workplace has shaped her heart and her mind and her soul. And that's precisely what Uniondale Foundation for Educational Excellence is all about. That's what it's all about. Anytime you talk about excellence, you all know you're not just talking about information, you're talking about transformation as well. What the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, paideia. deep education. Of course, they had built on Pythagoras from Egypt, going back to the great African civilization. What Plato had in mind was first a formation of attention. How do you get each of us, but especially our young people, to shift from the superficial to the substantial? To shift from the frivolous to the serious. Or the shift from the G-string and the bling-bling to truth and justice. Book 7 of Plato's Republic, he talks about distinguishing between the whirling of a shell and the turning of a soul. And that's what paideia is about pedagogy. It's about the turning of a soul, so that when you shift from the surface things of life and begin to deal with the deep and profound issues of life, that requires an educational experience, whether it occurs in a school, on a block, in a synagogue, temple, church, or in the nightclub, if the love hits you in a certain kind of way. And we laugh and smile, but we need some turning of the souls these days. And when I look at you all, I must say I want to salute each and every one of you for supporting these young brothers and sisters, because their attempt to highlight the quest for educational excellence among our brothers and sisters of all colors, cultures, civilizations, means in fact that you are willing to embark on this journey of keeping alive this very fragile experiment in democracy called the USA, because believe me, education is the lifeblood of any democratic experiment. And if you lose sight of the deep turning and folk obsessed with materialism, hedonism, narcissism, G-string, bling bling, and not concerned with public interest and common good, and raising deep questions about who they are and their role in society and the service that they can render, you end up losing your democracy. You all constitute the glue that hold this fragile experiment in democracy called the USA together. And that's why anytime I'm in a room with educators in the deep sense, I am profoundly humbled. Because I know, crack vessel that I am who I am. Not just because somebody loved me and cared for me and were concerned about me, but because the teachers that I had, the principals that I had, they cared so much enough to keep track of what they thought I could be. You see? And they believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Told me I had potential. I might not have had it, but I believed it. And that takes on a force of its own. I was reminded I was part of a history, of a narrative. I could situate myself in relation to it. I could connect to a struggle, an intellectual struggle for truth and justice, political struggle for freedom and democracy and equality, and an existential struggle to try to be decent and compassionate before I die. So when you talk about paideia and educational excellence in its deepest sense, in this formation of attention and the cultivation of a self, to get our young people to really come to terms with reality. Don't live in a world of make-believe like the American Hamlet, Blanche Dubois on the streetcar named Desire, written by that white literary blues man called Tennessee Williams. So American to want to live in a world of denial of the night side, denial of the underside, denial of deep social misery, denial of forms of oppression and domination, and somehow think that you can create some deodorized space to forever inhabit. No. Myself personally, and I think many of us here around the world know that if you want to take seriously line 38A, Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. And you know, Malcolm X had in mind when he said the examined life is painful. That's especially so in America. America has to examine itself in relation to its precious children. The Greek actually says the examined life is not a life of the human. How do we get our young people to muster the courage to think critically for themselves and to wrestle with the most terrifying question that anyone another. That question of what it means to be human, what does it really mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? That's us. Put on your three-piece suit if you want to. Think you're somebody, wasn't for that love push of your mama in that stinking stench of blood, you wouldn't be here. That's the funk. That's part of what James Brown and George Clinton have in mind. Because we know the Latin word humano, which is the source of our word human, means burial. That's where humility comes from. That's where humanity comes from. That we're earth-bound, we're connected to the ground, the soil, the dust, and the dirt. And that our bodies will someday be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. Unless you're out for cremation. It's a terrifying question. Nobody gets out of space and time alive. Got a death sentence. Day you're born. First day of your birth means you're old enough to die. Education is fundamentally about wrestling with that question of what it means to be human, to become cultivated, educated. But you have to unsettle yourself. You have to be challenged. You have to be unnerved, and maybe even for a moment unhoused. And that's what our young people need. They need to be challenged. They need to be taken so seriously that we take them outside of the materialism and hedonism and narcissism that bombard them every day with a market-driven way of life that tries to convince them that to be human is to be stimulated and titillated rather than critically engaged with wrestling with what it means to be human. I'm excited about these young brothers and sisters playing this music. Uiondale Jazz Band. I tell you, anytime you use that word jazz, you're talking about something serious. Profoundly serious. Louis Armstrong, Sarah Vaughan, Thelonious Monk, Carmen McRae. They wrestle with the question of what it means to be human. They come from a blues people. And blues is an autobiographical chronicle of a personal catastrophe expressed lyrically and coped with without falling into the bitter cup of revenge and bitterness. How do you deal with the catastrophic in such a way that you can still create something beautiful the way Bessie Smith did, and Ma Rainey did, and the way Louis Armstrong did, or the way John Coltrane did, or the way Miles did? It's not just blues and jazz. We've got to bring Curtis Mayfield in here, Luther Vandross in here, Aretha in here, Al Green in here. Bring a little Chuck D and KRS-One and Rod Digger and Queen Latifah in here. But we don't want to separate the music from the education, because there was a time for people dealing with the catastrophic in America where the only way in which we could educate and cultivate ourselves was to hold our hands in ring shout at night, raising our voices in such a way that somehow we could define our humanity over against the white supremacist slavery that tried to convince us we were less than human, less beautiful, less intelligent. That was a form of paideia taking place. Oh yes, we were educated. Didn't have schools in those days. It was against the law for black people to learn how to read and write in those days. But lifting those voices, that anthem of a blues people that James Weldon Johnson and his brother wrote in Florida in 1903 said what? There's a people concerned about educational excellence, but in the context of slavery, they can't do it within the schools in place. But education's taking place. Because they shifted from the frivolous to the serious. You can't listen to steal away. You can't listen to wade in the water. God gonna trouble the water. Which means you're only educated when you're dealing with trouble. Your soul is only shaped when you're dealing with trouble. Look how far we come. My God. Quite a struggle. That paideia in America those people who start roots in Africa and New World African experience, but have routes, R-O-U-T-E-S, that embrace all of humanity. And it is a grand tradition that has something to say about not just themselves and not just America, but the world. One of the saddest features of our present moment is the degree to which so many young people have little access to the greatness of this history, of this story, of this struggle. How could it be that these particular peoples, wrestling with paideia under catastrophic circumstances, somehow was able to produce art, text, sculpture, architecture, and most importantly, lives that were constructed as works of art, rooted in a Socratic imperative of critically examining themselves and their society and the world, and bearing witness in such a way that we would remember them, so that our lives themselves would become the means through which their afterlife in space and time is preserved. You all understand what I'm talking about? The afterlife of a Harriet Tubman in Dorothy Height. The afterlife of a Frederick Douglass in Martin King. How do you keep it alive? What will our communities and society look like 50 or 100 years from now? If we lose sight of those kinds of afterlives and instead the hedonism, materialism, narcissism becomes so pervasive and ubiquitous that people really believe to be human is to be he or she who has the most material toys. Who really believes, as so many of our young people are wrestling with every day, that orgiastic pleasures are substitute for profound joy. Who really believe that coming together in community is a utopian ideal that belongs more and more in the museum when they look at the History Channel, as if that struggle for freedom belongs in some calcified museum rather than being a vital and vibrant tradition that they can become a part of and participate in and contribute in and attempt to take it higher. Which means, of course, and you all know better than I, you got cut radically against the grain. Radically against the grain. Part of the problem is that, you see, America is what Henry James called a hotel civilization. And I know we're in a nice hotel here. William James, you know, one of the finest American writers, left America because he thought the hotel civilization was characterized by human beings and individuals who were magnificent when it came to technological ingenuity. Magnificent when it came to market innovation. It's true. America has much to offer the world in terms of technological innovation, in terms of market innovation and so forth. But he said there's something about a hotel where the lights are always on. Never really dark. The evening room was clean. It was dirty. You come back, it's clean. Don't know who cleaned it really. Don't know whether they're being treated with dignity or not. It's just about your comfort, your convenience, your contentment. And so it leads America to easily fall in with this notion that we're not just a city on the hill, but we're a city on the hill to always congratulate and celebrate, as if there's no night side and underside, no funk in the deodorized space. That's what it is to live in a state of denial. It is always a sign of adolescent immaturity not to come to terms with reality and history and memory that's connected to the night side, rather than just sunshine. It's like Peter Pan, forever innocent, never doing anything, never growing up, don't have to deal with time and history, just forever young. Or like Disney World, and Disneyland where there's no life and death, it's just fun. Where there is no death, there's no life. You know that in terms of our education system, I tell my students at Princeton all the time, right? Love of wisdom, philosophy, meditation, on the preparation for death. To philosophize is to learn how to die, Montaigne says, that great French Catholic philosopher. He who learns how to die unlearns slavery, says Seneca. And to learn how to die is what? To critically examine yourself in such a way that you give up certain dogma, assumptions, and presuppositions. And when you give certain assumptions and presuppositions up, it's a form of death so that you can be reborn, become more mature, and developed. Much more courageous to cut against the grain. I say we never fully live until white supremacy dies. Never fully live until male supremacy dies. Anti-Jewish hatred dies. Anti-Arab bigotry dies. Hatred of gay brothers, lesbian sisters dies. This is not PC chit-chat, y'all. These are deep assumptions and presuppositions that we all bring into the world, given the historical moment that we grow up, and if we don't push it back, then the forms of poison and dullness sets in, and no democracy can survive without education, without learning how to die by critically examining yourself in such a way that you become more mature, more developed, more refined, more willing to courageously step into what you consider to be the unknown. That's what the U.S. Civil War was about, right? The fact that you have no reference to the institution of slavery in your Constitution, you end up fighting a civil war over an institution not invoked in your Constitution. Hypocrisy and mendacity coming back on ya. What Malcolm called chickens coming home to roost. What it is. You're going to act as if you got a free society and 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies are enslaved Africans. Who does we the people include? Could you specify, please? Could you break it down to us, please? No, it didn't include indigenous peoples. You were clear about that. It says explicitly, savages will not be part of body politic. Appreciate the clarity. Didn't include women of any color. Patriarchal mentality. Didn't include 22% of the inhabitants whose labor constituted the wealth upon which the democracy was founded. Yet you call yourself a city on the hill full of liberty. Okay, we're still open to the hypothesis. Who do you have in mind? And they did have in mind some very courageous white brothers fighting against the cruel British Empire. That's what they had in mind. And thank God for that anti-imperial struggle. Thank God for the Constitution written in such a way that at least they were open enough to revision. So once their denial was radically called into question, once their hypocrisy was revealed and their mendacity disclosed by Frederick Douglass and others, you can have a 14th Amendment and do away with an institution that invoked in your Constitution. A little embarrassing. But you almost lost your experiment in democracy because of it. You see, it's one reason why these days this talk about race is so very important. People think it's just a luxury. Well, I guess it's about time to talk about race again. Even Brother Obama took him 13 months to kick in. Come on, brother. You know you got to hit it sooner or later, brother. You're a black man. True. I mean, I love my brother, you know. But he's not an ex-Negro like me. No, I'm going to talk about it. You don't talk about to alienate people at all. You talk about it because, see, I come out of the Hebrew scripture tradition. First century Palestinian Jew named Jesus tradition that says the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. So if you're concerned about truth, you better listen to the folk catching hell. That's the Israelites in the Hebrew scripture, isn't it? Don't talk about truth, Amos says, unless you allow the enslaved to be heard, even if Pharaoh turns this. But Jesus on the cross, unarmed truth, unconditional love, crushed lost in the face of catastrophic circumstances, but that very witness of truth and love become the very conditions by which your soul can be turned in a positive way. That's my tradition. I don't think that ought to be everybody's tradition in that sense. I'm just a Christian. I'm ashamed, but I know everybody's a Christian. That's fine too. We just have a dialogue about it. We talk about it. But for black people, talking about education, you can't separate that need for courage to think critically without talking about the ways in which they critically appropriated the quest for truth and justice, such that they were always willing to be honest and candid and speak unflinchingly about who was catching tail. That's Micah 6:8. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. Keep track of the weak, keep track of the widow, keep track of the stranger, keep track of he or she whose suffering is being rendered invisible, losing contact with it. And yet America rarely wants to hit it head on. It takes a civil war to say, I think we've got a problem called white supremacy here. And then, as you know, for 12 years, America tries to do something unprecedented. Our young people need to know this. Even when they talk about Brother Obama, they need to know in the 1870s there were 2 black senators from Mississippi called Reconstruction. Great W.B. Du Bois wrote a classic on it in 1935. It's unprecedented in the modern world to create a multiracial democracy. It only lasted for 12 years, which meant that the Union Army, which breaks the back of white supremacist slavery, they won the war. White supremacy wins the peace in 1877. And for over 100 years, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, lynching. Every 2.5 days, some black body, black child, black woman, a black man hanging from some tree, that southern tree, that strange fruit the southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang about with such power. The Jewish brother Maripol writing the lyrics. Yes, that was part of America too. It had much to do with the quest for educational excellence, because it stood in the way. And it would separate black people in the United States from black people in the Western Hemisphere, because one thing all New World Africans share is an experience of slavery. Brazil, Jamaica, Barbados. But in the United States, there emerged a system of terrorism called Jim and Jane Crow. And it tried to so thoroughly niggerize black people that the very notion of educational excellence became far-fetched in the minds of many of them, because to become niggerized is to become so scared and intimidated and rendered so hopeless and helpless and deferential to the powers that be that you don't even keep track of the basis of niggerization. And in the 19th century, it was white greed, it was white fear, and it was white hatred. We don't like to talk about that when we talk about race. They call it race relations. Race relations. No, there's a hierarchy here. Race relations is not some egalitarian context in which dialogue takes place and everybody intervenes. You got folk hanging from trees. You got folk who can't go to schools that have resources. And you have to say it in a loving way. We got to be able to speak these kinds of truths in such a way that our white and brown and yellow and red brothers and sisters know that the righteous indignation at the injustice is not the same as a malice toward them. There's a history of white brothers and sisters, and red brothers and sisters, and Jewish brothers and sisters who had a righteous indignation at white supremacy. That history needs to be brought forward. John Brown was no joke. Miles Horton was no joke. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was no joke. They stood on truth and justice as they understood it and spoke with a righteous indignation against any form of injustice, beginning with white supremacy in America. Oh, if we lose that tradition too, then how are we going to have a discussion of it? How can we have a dialogue about it? And it's crucial to talk about this in regard to our young people. Why? Because niggerization is an attempt to so thoroughly implant white mean trashing, demeaning, and degrading folk who look like you? Or does that mean fighting for truth and justice? Thurgood Marshall was big and bad, but he didn't pose in posture. He put his life on the line. Very, very different. Casting the young sisters like they're objects of sexual predatory activity. Conquering big and bad. No, that's just imitating the worst of any modern culture. From Jesse James on one hand to Scarface and Al Capone on the other. That's called gangsterism. The young black folk didn't create gangsterism, they imitated gangsterism. Every group has it, every culture has it, every civilization has it. But once it becomes more and more pervasive as a way of defining keeping it real, it's difficult for our precious young people to understand that there's ways of keeping it real that also allow you to think critically for yourself so that you don't have to deal with the narrow forms of conformity and complacency and cowardice. And especially cowardice. George Bernard Shaw used to say, hatred is the coward's revenge against those who intimidate them. Hatred is always a species of cowardice, which means that white supremacy, not just a lie, not just real, it's cowardly. And when you look at the best of black people's quest for freedom, which is always inseparable from the quest for literacy, you hear truth, justice. This is a lesson America needs to learn since 9/11. First time in the history of the nation, all Americans feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who they are. I say to myself, be black in America for 400 years. Unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, hated for who you are, to one degree or another. White brother says, Brother West, I just can't get over this sense of being hated. So I said, you don't say. Ask Jamal about it, he'll tell you. Teacher, she'll tell you. Ask any black parent that has to explain to their precious young child, 3 or 4 years old, who comes home and said, I've been hated, so what do I do? How do I negotiate and navigate through this? Oh, the educational excellence that we're talking about tonight has everything to do with the future of American democracy. Because believe me, when black people had to deal with American terrorism, what were the dominant responses to it? Look at Emmett Till's mother. How did she respond to American terrorism when her precious baby was murdered by cowardly white supremacists, cowardly American terrorists in gut bucket Jim Crow, Mississippi? She brought the body back to Chicago. You all know this story. Our young people need to know this story. Emmett Till. No accident, our greatest writer, Toni Morrison. Her only play is on Emmett. It's a turning point. August 55, 3 months before Sister Named Rosa Parks courageously set out in order to stand up for justice. 3 months before that moment, there was Emmett Till, her only baby, whose father fought in the U.S. Army. She said, no, we're going to keep the casket open. They kept the casket open. They went to Robert Temple Church of God in Christ outside Chicago. 50,000 people saw his body. John Johnson took a picture of it, put it in heaven, put it in Jet Magazine. The underside of American democracy, yes. And what did she say when she stepped to the lectern? This has everything to do with paideia, everything to do with wisdom, everything to do with spiritual maturity. She looked over the lectern at her baby's head. His head was 5 times the size of his ordinary head. And she said, I don't have a minute to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. And that's what Mamie did. That's precisely what Mamie did. Martin King had the same challenge when he had to give the funeral of 4 precious young sisters in the 16th Street Baptist Church who were murdered by cowardly white supremacists and cowardly American terrorists. On the first time he cried in public, what did he say in the face of that kind of terrorism? Somehow we've got to muster the armor of love and justice and truth in the face of this terror. They spoke on behalf not just of the best of black people, not just on the best of America, they spoke on behalf of the best of the human spirit. When America's terrorized and niggerized in that way, do we hear those voices? Do we hear we'll hunt them down like cockroaches? Nobody messes with us. We'll crush you, bring you back dead or alive. We the police of the world. We got machismo identity. We pose in posture because we don't allow anybody to terrorize us? Do we hear voices like Mom Teal? Do we hear voices like Martin in the face of 9/11? I say to myself, if black people had responded to American terrorism in that way, it would have been a civil war every generation. Wouldn't have a democracy. I was in Egypt the other day. They said, Brother West, how come there's no black Al-Qaeda? I'll tell you why there's not a black Al-Qaeda. Because there was some deep quest for educational excellence that produced the Martin Kings and Fannie Lou Hamers and Duke Ellingtons and Paul Robesons and W.B. Du Boises. True. I tell my white brothers and sisters, when you see Negroes, you ought to just give them a standing ovation. Thank you for Duke. Thank you for Martin. Thank you for Fannie. Thank you for Louis. Didn't have to be that way, you know. Black folk could have gone for revenge rather than justice. Didn't have to read Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice to know the difference between justice and revenge and the quality of mercy. Or why is it so that when the white mainstream hears Brother Martin Luther King Jr. talk about his unconditional love for Bull O'Connor, he gets a standing ovation? Yet if he speaks of his unconditional love for Elijah Muhammad and Minister Louis Farrakhan, all of a sudden must be a follower of the most bigoted and terroristic group. As if unconditional love is not open to all, no matter how you agree or disagree. Well, O'Connor was actually crushing young black babies. And Martin and Fannie stood up and said what? We will never succumb to a gangster response even though we're being gangsterized. We'd rather be defeated momentarily and right than win and be gangsters. That's a great tradition. It has everything to do with education. Or as Malcolm used to say, it's a decay, but only that kind of education is only for Negroes. When it comes to other folk, no, we're not going to push that unconditional love too far. We're not going to embrace our enemies at that deep human level. No. Let those Negroes go on and trot that stuff out. Sorry being too honest and candid here tonight, but we're talking about educational excellence. We're talking about education. Ain't nothing stuff on steel. Yes, we want to read and write. Yes, we want to do their homework. Yes, we want to defer gratification. Yes, we want them to gain access to dynamite jobs. But we also come from a tradition that says we will not confuse success with greatness. We don't want just successful young people who become well-adjusted to injustice. No, we come from a people that says our education is tied to also our greatness, and our greatness has to do with the depth of our service to others and the quality of our love of others. It manifests in how we treat others. Don't confuse financial prosperity with moral magnanimity. Don't confuse individual security with personal integrity. No, education has to do with a turning of a soul in which the mind and the heart and soul are involved. And in the end, as John Dewey, the great public philosopher of American democracy, and I can feel him turning over in his grave today when he looks at our disgraceful school systems in chocolate cities, in vanilla rural pockets. John Dewey, the great philosopher of democratic education. Wondering what happens to American democracy when young folk are not taught how to muster the courage to think critically. You say, well, Brother West, how do we go about not just teaching the young folk this, but trying to convince them that this is a way of life? And for me, the major option is young folk would rather see a sermon than hear one. Examples of the go-kart of judgment. Bad judgment, bad examples. When I understand why our young people have strayed in materialistic, hedonistic, and narcissistic ways, in part it has to do with us looking at ourselves. We've become so successful. How many of us aspire to greatness? The way our grandmothers and grandfathers did in terms of quality of service is something bigger than us. To get outside of our egocentric predicaments. You end up with a generation of peacocks walking around, showing their foliage. Look at me, I'm so accomplished, I'm so learned. Look at my degrees, look at my lineage, look at my genealogy. And it's a beautiful thing now. I love that introduction, y'all. I was impressed by that genealogy. Look at now, I don't take this thing too far. I was impressed. Because I know you worked hard, and I know folks love you enough, sacrificed enough for you to be able to seize that opportunity, but you also know what? That I want to see greatness, and I'm seeing it tonight in terms of just quality of service. That's the key. That's the key. You know, old folk used to say peacocks strut because they can't fly. Of your own privacy. Can't make the public connection to something bigger than you. See, and that's true that peacocks actually do fly scientifically, but that's not the point. It's folk wisdom. When I look at these young folk, I see eagles. I see eagles. And I think of the greatest sermon of the 20th century, preached by a genius who gave birth to a genius. The daughter's called Aretha Franklin, and the father's called Reverend C.L. Franklin. Maybe his sermon was called The Eagle Stirs the Nest. And the eagle is somebody who soars high and looks low in order to keep track of the least of these. That goes in the 25th chapter of Matthew. And you'll be measured by your greatness no matter what your success in terms of your concern for others, your willingness to serve others, never forgetting those others and lifting as you climb. That's why this group is so very important. And that's true not just for them, but true for any group, any color, any gender, any sexual orientation, and especially those of us who still have the audacity to believe in the possibility of democracy. Because in the end, it is, as Sly Stone says, about everyday people. Sly says everybody is a star. Everyday people have a dignity. They have a right to decency. The late great James Cleveland called them what? Ordinary people. Doing extraordinary things because they muster the courage to think critically for themselves, but also the courage to empathize, and most importantly, the courage to act, and by acting constitute witness. And that witness is the raw stuff for hope. I know Brother Barack talks about hope a lot. I always tell the brother, don't confuse the blues conception of hope with American optimism. They're qualitatively different. That's why King's dream was never the American dream. It was rooted in the American dream. Work hard, defer gratification, upward mobility, no problem with it. But it was the quality of service and depth of love so that you hold at arm's length the crass materialism, hedonism, and narcissism. It's a dialectical critique of the American dream because he was bringing with him a blues sensibility. And if you have a blues sensibility, any talk about hope is in the face of catastrophic circumstances. It could be the prison-industrial complex today. It could be the drug industry in the hood. It could be families wrestling with struggles for intimacy. Brothers wrestling access to a job. Catastrophic. B.B. King sings, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. That's a catastrophic situation. You're in the world, nobody loves you. You could be Michael Jackson and Britney Spears and still have catastrophic blues if nobody loves you, and all you got is just your mansion and your commodities and material things. You're still in a world of trouble. So this notion of hope, how do we somehow, in our quest for educational excellence, connect courage to think critically for yourself by trying to pique the curiosity of our young people, expand their imagination, get them interested in the world of ideas, not simply because it's connected to their individual success, but connected to their individual success so that they can become great by being able to serve others. That's the challenge. And let us be very clear about this, that there's no guarantee that we will succeed. And you all know that better than I. There's no guarantee that we can preserve the great legacy of greatness itself. We could be witnessing the slow decline and decay of the American empire. All American empires ebb and flow and come and go. The British did, the Romans did, the French did, the Belgians did. And when you look at the level of decay and decline in America these days that people don't want to talk about, you have to be honest. And you say, my God, is that all there is? Given all of this sacrifice of all Americans of all colors, to come to 2008 and see the greed and the bigotry and the fear and the anxiety somehow polarizing, dividing, balkanizing us in such a way that we can't even talk to one another. That indifference sets in. The great Rabbi Abraham Heschel used to say, indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself. Indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep. It's the very essence of inhumanity. Coarsened conscience and hardened heart. And I know you all are cutting against that grain every day. Uphill every day. And of course, again, this indifference and the greed and the hatred comes in all colors, to all genders. That's what I mean. Persons like yourselves constitute the glue to hold this fragile experience of democracy together. And our young people, they are 100% of the future. And if we lose sight of them, we hide and conceal what they're up against. 22% of them live in poverty, the richest nation in the history of the world. That's a moral disgrace. A moral disgrace. You can imagine what the American giver is going to say 500 years from now when talking about America. How are those people talking about those precious children of all colors living in poverty, given all that wealth? He bragged about how much wealth they had. Look at their buildings. They could see celebrations of unbelievable material prosperity. What happened to the children, the red children on this reservation? 40%. The brown precious babies, 39%. The black babies, 38%, living in poverty. None of them choose the parents that they have. Those are the kind of challenges that we have. And I don't believe any one of us have a full-fledged solution to it. We have to work on it together. There's no push-button panaceas to it. But we know it has much to do with our priorities, the choices that we make, and they have consequences. It is not just a matter of Democratic Party, Republican Party, Independent, or Ralph Nader every 4 years. Because if we don't come together and deal with it, truth, justice, we all go down. We either hang together or we hang separately. We all go down together. Thank God for the Uniondale Foundation for Educational Excellence, and I appreciate you allowing me to say a few words. God bless you.